Hey folks, and welcome to our first video on Surrealist Cinema. So I want to begin by acknowledging the ubiquity of the word surreal, or the popular idea of surrealism. Michael Richardson has this book, Surrealism and Cinema, and he begins in a similar way, acknowledging that word. He says, in everyday parlance, misunderstandings about surrealism abound. We frequently come across the epithet surreal being used to refer to scenes or even whole films in a way that seems wholly arbitrary. At least it is difficult to find any consistency in such usage. Certainly, where people in the past might have said, how bizarre, they tend now to say, how surreal. Frequently, the word seems to mean nothing or simply denotes something that is slightly out of the ordinary. Any time a word or a concept has so saturated popular culture that we find it difficult to define what that word means, I think it's a good reason to go back to the movement it derives from to help specify that term or concept. So I think we can start with a fairly useful bare bones definition from Wikipedia. Wikipedia says surrealism is a cultural movement that developed in the aftermath of World War I, in which arts depicted unnerving, illogical scenes and developed techniques to allow the unconscious mind to express itself. The two primary ideas that I think we're going to explore here are what it means to say that there are scenes that are illogical and what it means to say that we're exploring the unconscious mind. Another way of beginning our investigation of surrealism is to look at the word itself. The original term in French takes the word realism and puts the prefix sur in front of it. Sur means beyond, so it really means just beyond realism or beyond reality. And André Breton, often considered one of the founders of surrealism, he wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, otherwise known as the Manifesto of Surrealism, said, one of the aims of surrealism is to resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, a super reality, or in other words, a beyond reality. So it's important to note that the beyond reality of surrealism isn't exactly, say, a manifesto about the supernatural. It's really suggesting that the beyond reality is in the realm of the mind, of dreams, of that which is usually suppressed. David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson in their gloss of surrealism echo this idea. They say surrealist art, influenced by Freudian psychology, wanted to plumb the hidden currents of the unconscious. So here you can see that this beyond reality lies in the unconscious mind. And the notion of the unconscious mind that the surrealists were adopting came directly from Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud, often considered the father of psychoanalysis, is probably most famous for his idea of the unconscious mind. The conscious mind is the small portion of the mind we're aware of in our day-to-day lives that involves our thoughts, our sense perceptions, everything that we're aware of, whereas the unconscious involves the desires and drives that we are unaware of, but often influence our actions and behaviors. Our fears, unacceptable sexual desires, violent motives, shameful needs, and experiences. At the turn of the 20th century, Freud wrote, perhaps his most influential book, The Interpretation of Dreams, whose core idea was that dreams are products of unconscious desires. So here you can understand where the importance of dreams and the unconscious mind in surrealism comes from. Once again, André Breton, the author of the Manifesto of Surrealism, written in 1924, says this: surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of association, heretofore neglected in the omnipotence of dreams, in the undirected play of thought. So if the backbone of Freudian psychoanalysis is to say that most of the ills in society and the individual suffering that we have as human beings comes as a result of not being able to access our unconscious, surrealism is a movement that follows a similar line of thinking. We need to liberate the unconscious in order to liberate ourselves, to liberate society, and to liberate art. So now let's look at some of the historical conditions of surrealism. First and foremost, surrealism is a revolutionary reaction against the rationalism of society that contributed to World War I. Remember that Wikipedia definition that said that surrealism is always about the illogical and the unconscious. What the surrealists were primarily targeting was the dominance of rationality and rational thought, especially the way that the horrors of society, including war, can be justified or motivated under the name of rationalism. And I think it's worthy to mention here that André Breton, the author of the Manifesto, was in fact sent to war during World War I as a medic. And it was at this time that he actually talked to shell-shocked soldiers and deployed some of the methods of Freudian psychoanalysis. It's safe to say that the emergence of Surrealism is not merely a reaction to World War I, but it was also a reaction to and was influenced by the art movements that preceded, namely the Dadaist movement. Dada was also a revolutionary movement, similarly attacked rationality and reveled in a kind of nonsense in its artistic productions. And finally, to kind of put these things together, you might say that Surrealism, in its deepest motivation, was about embracing the irrational and the unconscious as a means of undermining the suffocating rationalism of society. Surrealism was not just a celebration of the weird or the unsettling for the sake of the weird or the unsettling. At its base, it wanted to contradict or oppose the norms of society, and the way that civilization, in its very definition, represses the illogical, the irrational, and the truth of our deepest desires and fears. Okay, now let's look at some of the methods and characteristics of Surrealist art. One of the core methods of Surrealist art making is called automatism. The idea of automatism is to simply produce art without pre-planning or forethought. It's a way of just letting ideas flow from you. The way that in the automatic drawing on your left by André Masson from 1933, the line seems to just continue in this free-flowing manner without any planning. Or in the exquisite corpse drawing on the right, which is a composite drawing from 4 artists. It's the method of how the exquisite corpse drawing was produced that matters as much as the content that results. Exquisite corpse usually names a technique in which a piece of art is collectively produced, often by individuals taking turns. So one person starts drawing a form or a line and they pass it off to another person in the circle and they continue the form. And so what you get is something that emerges not from one individual's pre-planning, but something that kind of exists across the minds of the group participating. So it's important to know that there's tons of Surrealist art that isn't produced through these means of automatism. And that another way of defining or understanding Surrealist art is by looking at the common characteristics that emerged in the art that we call Surrealist. So those characteristics can be simplified in this way. Surrealist art usually has dreamlike imagery, elements that shock or surprise the viewer or spectator, and unexpected or strange juxtapositions, what you might call incongruities and transformations, or instances where an object is transforming into another object. So as a kind of introduction to these characteristics, we might look at probably the most famous popular work of Surrealist painting, The Persistence of Memory, sometimes called The Melted Clocks, a painting by Salvador Dali, a Spanish artist, in 1931. First, I want to begin with a fun fact about the painting, which is that it's really small. It's about the size of a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. But more important than that, I want to get into some of the ways that the painting might represent larger characteristics of Surrealist painting. The first thing that I think that we should note about the painting is that it is fairly realistic in how it renders its scene and its objects. That might seem strange for me to say that it's realistic, because certainly the things that it depicts are not real. Clocks don't melt in real life. But it's the style, the form of the painting that actually follows a lot of the conventions of pre-modernist painting. If you simply look at the rocks in the background and the reflection, you're getting so many conventions of the way three-dimensionality is depicted following Renaissance painting. Look at the use of light and shadow and three-dimensionality. Linda Williams, who's a film scholar and wrote a book on Figures of Desire, which is all about Surrealism in cinema, kind of makes this point about Surrealist painting quite clear. She says the Surrealist expansion of the poetic image into the realm of the visual arts resulted in the readoption of conventions of figural art abandoned by Cubism. And we might also say abandoned or at least muted by Impressionism and Expressionism. Recognizable objects, she says, were once again given a certain existence in space. So just look at 3 more well-known works of Surrealist painting. While the content of these paintings, that is the objects depicted in these paintings, are strange and otherworldly, note that each of them has conventional uses of light and shadow and three-dimensionality. That's really apparent in the painting on the left and in the middle. It's less apparent in the painting on the right, which is in a sense non-representational, right? These are not recognizable objects in the world that are depicted. However, unlike, say, an abstract expressionist painting, while I can't recognize the objects in this painting, I still see them as objects. They have a distinct three-dimensionality. They cast shadows, and they seem to exist in a kind of three-dimensional space. So much of the movements in painting in the 19th and 20th centuries were suppressing the conventions of representing three-dimensional space. The Impressionists started to get you to see the thickness of paint as distinct from the object represented. The Cubists broke down perspective altogether, and the abstract expressionists in the mid-century completely obliterated figuration. But so many of the most famous surrealist paintings do have this figural realism. So what makes it surrealist then? Well, if we continue that Linda Williams passage, she says that while recognizable objects were once again given a certain existence in space, these objects were often composite creations or strangely deformed. Let's take a look again at the objects that are represented in this painting. They're melted clocks. Even before we kind of use a symbolism interpretation to say that the clocks represent time, or get into Dali's interest in space-time relativity, we can say that it's important that we have ordinary objects that have a kind of artificial hardness that are made strange by taking on the organic properties of a soft melting object. Right? So at its base, what we have is an incongruity. You take one recognizable thing and you give it the properties of another recognizable thing, and you put those things together. That idea of incongruity, either between two objects that don't belong together, or the idea of one object and another object kind of fused together, is one of the baseline characteristics of surrealism. In fact, the proto-surrealist poet Pierre Reverdy says, "The more the relationship between the two juxtaposed realities is distinct and true, the stronger the image will be, the greater its emotional power and poetic reality." So we can see that idea of incongruity or strange juxtaposition or metamorphosis in a number of different surrealist works. Surrealist sculptures tend to do this, like in Salvador Dali's Lobster Phone, or in one of Merritt Oppenheim's objects, in this case what's sometimes colloquially known as the furry cup. Right? You take an object, a cup and saucer, and then you give it qualities associated with something that's opposed to it. Just like the clocks that are melting, an artificial man-made hard object given the qualities of an organic object, like melting cheese. In this case, we have an artificial hard object, like a cup and saucer, given the furriness of an animal. The lobster phone does something similar. But instead of giving the qualities of one object to another object, it kind of fuses two objects together. In the painting, The Triumph of Surrealism by Max Ernst, if you look closely, you can see that this singular form, which has a head, two arms, and two legs, is actually made up of many other forms. It is sort of the idea of depicting something that is the result of a composite. Going back to the Dali painting, we can see further this idea of juxtaposition if we look at a detail of another object. In the bottom left corner of the frame is this pocket watch, the only timepiece whose face is not visible, but it's covered in ants. So once again, even before we move to a kind of symbolism, we can say that what we get is incongruity or juxtaposition. Just as the artificial man-made clocks took on the quality of melting associated with organic matter, the pocket watch littered with ants seems to take on the qualities of a rotten piece of fruit or a dead animal that might be decaying and be fed upon by an army of ants. It's also worth noting that swarms of ants were one of Dali's favorite motifs. And finally, we might look at one of the strangest figures in the painting, this kind of animal that takes up the foreground. At a glance, it maybe looks like a recognizable animal, but when we look closely, we realize it doesn't conform to any shape in the world. It looks both like an animal lying on the floor and also a kind of facial profile, and some people will say that this is actually a hidden self-portrait of Dali himself. Notice the nose and the eye and the eyelash and the tongue. So once again, we get this strange juxtaposition or incongruity of animal and human, but we also get the evocation of sleeping, which the closed eye might make us think of. So while there's tons more to say about a painting like this, I just want to show some of the general characteristics that might make this painting a surrealist one. Dreamlike imagery, elements that shock or surprise, unexpected juxtapositions, incongruities, and transformations. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge something that a lot of art historians and scholars will say. Richardson says, surrealism has been transformed for many people into an evanescent category denoting a strangeness or incongruity of juxtaposition, kind of the way that we talked about the Dali painting. But he says it is important to emphasize the extent to which surrealism from its very origins has consistently refused to be identified as any sort of style. If both Dali and Magritte were surrealists, it was to the extent that they embraced a shared moral sensibility. Their painting is the result of this commitment rather than its aim. So we might take from this the idea that while there are a number of characteristics that seem to make a surrealist work of art identifiable, it might have mattered more to the surrealists themselves, not the characteristics of their artworks, but their shared values and commitments as part of the surrealist movement, and also their shared methods. Salvador Dali, for instance, often came up with strange and ingenious ways of accessing his own unconscious mind. He famously would fall asleep holding a key, and so that as soon as the key hit the plate, he would wake up and effectively remember all the things that were going on in his mind just as he was transitioning from waking to sleeping. Okay, so if that's a kind of rundown of surrealism, how do we get from surrealism to surrealist cinema? It's important to note that in many different ways, the surrealists were drawn to cinema. In fact, André Breton, in that 1924 manifesto, said, "The cinema? 3 cheers for darkened rooms." So I think in that sentence, Breton is invoking an idea that is often understood within surrealist cinema, which is that movies are a lot like dreams. And it's not just the fact that movies are exhibited in the dark, similar to the places in which we sleep, but also the idea that movies give us images that are not actually real. Unlike theater, in which we see people act out scenarios before our very eyes, movies give us intangible projections, not unlike the intangible fleeting images that pop into our minds when we're dreaming. Linda Williams, in her book Figures of Desire, will explore more concrete ways in which surrealism and cinema kind of mutually enforced each other. So first, she looks at some of the commentary by that proto-surrealist poet Pierre Reverdy, and she draws this from his observations. She says, "One of the fundamental procedures of filmic creation consists in the concrete juxtaposition of distant realities." So if surrealist art is often understood to be about juxtaposing things that don't belong with each other, cinema might be a fantastic art form for doing just that because of editing. With editing, which might be one of the medium-specific cornerstones of cinema as a medium, you get to juxtapose whatever you want, as quickly as you want. And you can break the bonds of space and time. And in fact, the most famous surrealist films would do this very thing, would exploit editing to give us strange juxtapositions, not hidden ones. Second, Williams talks about another surrealist writer, Philippe Soupault, who says this, describing the transformative potential of what's known as the stop trick in cinema, which is also a result of editing, but is a slightly different practice. He says, "I sit down on a bench. Suddenly there appears beside me a man who changes into a woman, then into an old man. Just then another old man appears who changes into a baby, then into a woman. I get up and they all disappear." So what he's describing here is something that cinema can do, which was known since the very beginnings of the medium. The French filmmaker Georges Méliès invented what we often call the stop trick, which is a trick of editing where you record an object, you keep the camera in the same place, you remove the object, and then you keep recording. And then when you play it back, it looks like the object has disappeared, or perhaps you take the object and you replace it with another object. So in another sense, cinematic editing not only allows you to juxtapose 2 different objects, but it allows you to give the impression that one object has transformed into another. So we might say that cinema, beyond being a dreamlike medium, also has these capacities to exhibit some of the fundamental characteristics of surrealist art: strange juxtaposition and metamorphosis or transformation. And then Williams says something about these surrealist artists and their commentary on cinema that I think is really profound and useful. She says, "Although film is composed of images that are the most meticulous imitation of already significant fragments of reality ever made possible, the very fact that these fragments are so convincing makes their combination in a structure not intended to create the illusion of reality all the more surprising." So Williams is here noting that cinema is sometimes called the medium of art that has the closest connection to reality, because it's based in photography. And when you photograph something, or when you record it with a movie camera, you are preserving that object, and you are producing a very strong likeness to that object. She's acknowledging that you might think that cinema is the medium of reality. But here she's saying that the essence of cinema for the surrealists might be this combination of the realism of the image and the capacity to take that image and transform it quite easily with editing. And when you pair this observation with the fact that so many surrealist paintings had a kind of stylistic realism, it makes a ton of sense that cinema was a medium that the surrealists were interested in. Okay, so that's it for this first video on surrealism and cinema. In the next video, we're going to take a much closer look at some of the most famous and canonical works of surrealist cinema, including Un Chien Andalou, the film from 1929 made by surrealist painter and artist Salvador Dali, and Luis Buñuel, who came to be probably the most prolific surrealist filmmaker in the 20th century. I'll see you next time.